taking the time to join us. My name is Kirago Mwangi. I am based at BirdLife International in our Cambridge office, and I am a Senior Capacity Development Manager, and my role is coordinating our global program for capacity development and work with colleagues across the Secretariat and in the partnership to facilitate our projects and programs that facilitate institutional development, professional development, and as well as engagements across with other organizations that we work with. I have the honor and the pleasure to facilitate this session today, and I would like to welcome you all, and I'm very, very excited that we'll be hearing from distinguished speakers this morning on this interesting subject of gender equality and mainstreaming women empowerment. I would like, before I get on too far, to also mention that we are joined, I'll introduce our speakers in a moment. I'd like to introduce a few more of my colleagues who have been very involved in helping to facilitate this session. First is our team in our Amman office. This is a regional flyways facility that oversees the work of the Migratory Soaring Birds project. And I would like to welcome my colleagues Osama, Mona, who I think are all in the same space, to just quickly introduce themselves. And then I will also welcome Shannon, who's facilitating the back end of this webinar, to also just quickly introduce themselves. So shall I first welcome Osama and colleagues in Amman?
Okay, thank you, Kirago. Quickly, I'm Osama Nouri, the manager of the Migratory Soaring Bird project. And thank you all for your participating this morning.
Good morning. Thank you all. I'm Mona Al-Saq. I'm Middle East Flyway Officer in BirdLife International here in Amman office.
Hello, I'm Asra Akilan. I'm a Communication and Project Assistant in MSP project.
Fantastic. Shannon, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So good morning, everyone. My name is Shannon. I work here in Cambridge alongside Kirago on the MSB project.
Perfect. Thank you. So the first thing I'd like to do is to just set the context for the work we're doing. This is a 2-hour session, and we'll hear from 3 speakers. As you see on the banner of the webinar, we have a very interesting topic related to gender, and we are going to hear across 3 different levels of operations, one at a global level based on UNDP's experiences, and secondly, the BirdLife perspective, the BirdLife International Partnership perspective, and third, we'll hear about the work of how our national partner is able to mainstream the work of gender equality and women empowerment in the workplace projects and through programs. But before I welcome our speakers to introduce themselves, I would like to just mention a couple of points. That first, for those of you who are not familiar with the Migratory Soaring Birds, the context is that this project has been going on for just shy of over 9 years, and we're now in phase 2 of this project. It's funded by GEF, Global Environment Facility, executed by UNDP, and implemented by BirdLife International. The project works across Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Eritrea, but generally is a body of work that works across the Rift Valley flyways. The main focus is on 5 sectors to mainstream safeguards for migratory soaring birds in the energy, waste management, agriculture, hunting, and tourism sectors to work with stakeholders in those sectors to be conscientious of what they do, such that we can minimize negative impacts to migratory soaring birds. This webinar session hopefully is a first of a series of sessions that we will hope to run on different subject matters. And we want to start with this webinar session as a demonstration and a commitment to inclusivity and equity in commitment to gender equity and gender mainstreaming in the workplace projects and programs. To learn from our experts today, I have the pleasure to introduce to you Lisette Alberstein, who is a gender analyst for UNDP based in the Jordan Country Office, and with an academic background in political science, international, that intersects gender studies. She collaborates with project managers across multiple sectors in the environment, and including participation into livelihood to enhance gender responsiveness and outputs in the projects and activities. This is to help the interventions funded by UNDP to demonstrate inclusiveness and benefits for those farthest behind. Our second speaker is Charlotte Clinton. She is a global program coordinator for one of 9 BirdLife's global programs, particularly called Local Engagement and Empowerment Program. This has a work stream that focuses on mainstreaming rights and social issues across BirdLife's work, and further our local to global approach, working with partners at the local conservation groups. Our third speaker is Ala Ado, who is a gender specialist for RSCN and leads the work on gender mainstreaming for RSCN, and will speak to us about how RSCN has gone through from developing the guidelines to implementing them at the workplace. So, before I get any further and introduce our first speaker, I'd like to just quickly call in on Shannon to give us a bit of context on how we operate in case you have a question, in case anything goes wrong on your end, how to manage that particular situation. Shannon, do you want to take on?
Okay, thanks, Karagu.
Thanks.
So thanks everyone for joining. You will have noticed that automatically your videos and your microphones have been turned off. If we could all please keep it that way during the presentation so there's no disruptions to the presenters, that would be really good. But of course I invite the presenters to keep their video on when they're presenting, if they wish to do so. Each presenter will speak, and then we have a session for a Q&A afterwards. And the preference there is for everyone to use the chat function to write their questions down so we can keep track of them better. But if that for some reason isn't possible, then just raise your hand on the Zoom function, and then we'll get to you to answer a question that you may have. And also as well, this session will be recorded as well.
Thank you very much, Shannon.
Thanks, Karagu.
Right, so I take the opportunity to welcome our first speaker, Lisette. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Karagu, and thank you so much for the presentation and introduction. Shannon, I just want to hear, is it possible for the participants to be able to unmute their mics during my intervention?
Yeah, if that's okay. If you'd like them to do so, that's totally fine. They have control over their mics.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. All right, great.
Just for the most time to keep muted, that's fine.
Yes, that's all right. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me on board here today for this really interesting seminar. I'm looking forward to hearing from the colleagues from BirdLife and RSCN especially. about the more contextual interventions. As Kirago mentioned, I'm the gender analyst with UNDP, based in the Jordan country office. And I work with colleagues on ensuring, and especially project managers, ensuring that all our projects, regardless of the topic, whether they're livelihoods, environment, or political participation, whatever field we're working on in Jordan, that gender is always a component of the intervention. So let me get started by sharing my screen. I have a short presentation, which hopefully should be able to guide this conversation. I'm going to talk a bit about sort of the global goals and the global approach towards including gender into the work on development globally. And then we're going to talk a bit about the challenges towards this and what, at the end, what individual project managers and NGOs can do towards accomplishing gender equality. But first, I want to start out with understanding a bit about gender inequality, what it means to you, and how you, if you have experienced it and how you see it. And then we're going to move towards a definition of what it actually means to ensure that we're all on the same page. And I want to start out by this, because what I hear the most when I am talking to colleagues and when I am talking about gender equality, which I do a lot, is that there's the understanding that it only involves women. But that's not the case. Gender equality is as much about men, it's as much about boys. And I think the first little exercise that I want to do jointly with you guys is something that will help us understand better what gender inequality means to us as individuals, so that we know why it's important to address it in our projects, whether they're environment focused or livelihoods focused. So I hope you will join in, and feel free to maybe put your answer in the chat box, but also it would be great if you could unmute your mic. Just raise your hand first. If you go to the chat box, you can choose the raise hand, and then maybe Kirago can select who can open their mic, so we don't do it all in the same time. But let me start with myself. So in my culture, which is Danish, I grew up in Denmark. Because I am a woman, I am expected to take care of my family and prioritize family life over work time being in the office. But if I was a man, I could spend as many hours in the office on my career without anyone ever questioning what my children or my husband was doing at the same time. So that's my example of how gender inequality affects me. Now, Kirago, has anyone raised their hands? Can anybody want to contribute to this?
Not yet. Perhaps,
I would love to hear from you, Kirago.
Well, it's an interesting question. Because I am a man, I am expected to make sure my family have a home. And if I was a woman, I would be expected to be the primary carer for the children. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's how I see it. We've got a question. Mm-hmm. We've got someone who's raised their hand.
Yeah.
But Barend is a guest. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say it's exactly the same situation in the Netherlands. So yes, there's no question if I spend all my hours in the office as a man, whereas I think implicitly, if I were a woman, I would be asked, how would I manage to take care of my family, etc. So I'm same thing here.
Great.
Interesting. Anyone else would like to have a go? Shall I volunteer someone?
Yes.
Osama, you want to have a go?
Yes, thank you very much, Kirago. In my culture, because I am a man, I am the one that should bring money into the place. And if I am a woman, I can sit back at home and relax and enjoy the money spent that the man brings. Thank you.
Interesting, interesting.
And I answer also?
Please
Hi.
go ahead.
Yes. In my culture, because I'm a man, it's not my business to study my children. And if I was a man, I could do anything and I can stay out of my home without help my wife.
Okay. Maybe take one more example.
Yeah, let's go for one more.
Anyone else?
Lena just posted in the chat.
Oh yes, yes. We've got Lena, yeah, from Lebanon, who says in Lebanon, but she's a woman, I'm expected to cook, but if I was a man, I could wait until a hot meal is served without any help. Yeah, I guess captured a few stereotypes there.
Or to eat only.
Allah adds, or to eat only. Excellent.
Exactly. Thank you so much. Anyone else who wants to bring a last example from their own experiences or? Okay.
Well, hang on, we got Charlotte. Charlotte was going to volunteer herself as well.
Great.
Yeah, go on, Charlotte.
Just a different example. So I think in my culture, because I'm a woman, I often feel unsafe when I'm out walking alone, for example, and need to take precautions. But if I was a man, I think I would completely ignore that side of sort of fight or flight response.
Interesting.
Great. Good points. And I think the purpose of this really shows that why gender is relevant to discuss, as it shows that your gender shapes society's perception of who you are and what you can do, because your gender is not invisible towards others, and therefore there are certain expectations about what you should do. For example, that you should be cooking, and that affects our opportunities and what we are capable of doing.
Lisette, can I interrupt a little bit? There's one more example from Basima.
Yeah, please.
Also in Lebanon, who says, as a woman, I am questioned about my outings. If I am a man, I can stay outside all night as much as I want.
Brilliant, brilliant example. Basima. Thank you so much, Basima. Brilliant example. And please, as we go ahead, keep typing in the chat box and provide examples. I think that's a great example. And I think that's a very appropriate example to really showcase that it has limitations on your space and your ability to move, to do things because of your gender. And that's it's a very inequality on a personal and individual level, on a micro level, but which has ramifications and it has consequences in the broader society. And why is it that we have these expectations of people's ability to do something? And that's because we're social beings. We respond as individuals and as humans to the appreciation and recognition that we receive from the people we have around us. We can easily be manipulated through peer pressure and group dynamics. And it's a very common and basic concept within sociology. And this explains to us why it is that it's difficult to, for example, break out of stereotypes and do something differently, because it becomes a prophecy in itself, it's path dependency, and it's what we call socialization. We're socialized into taking on a role that is not dependent on our biology. It's not that women have a specific gene inside their body that makes them more capable of cooking dinner or doing the dishes or raising children. It's not a biological gene, it's socialization. And that is something that can be very and extremely difficult to challenge and to change. So while the bad news is that the gendered behavior, as the examples that we just heard from all of you now, can seem very hardwired, and thus also very difficult to challenge and to change. The good news is that gender inequality is not a biological fact. There is no such gene in anyone's body that makes them more capable of cooking, cleaning, caring for children, or to go to work and bring all the money back into the household, as we saw is what the pressure, the gender pressure that a lot of men, especially also in this region, where we have the ongoing project that we are all sort of coming together around and discussing gender in that context in the MENA region. So it's not a specific gene. So the good news is that it's a social phenomenon, it's socialization, and that actually gives us an opportunity to change and challenge this. So this actually brings us to the definition of what gender equality is, because we have now seen the examples that you provided of what gender inequality can look like. We know why it's happening. It's happening because of socialization. And when we talk about gender equality, what it is that we're referring to is the equal rights, responsibilities, and opportunities, not for women only, but for all people, both women and men, for girls and boys. And it's important, again, to recognize that gender equality, to achieve that, is inclusive. It's as much changing the dynamics around the expectations and stereotypes about what a real man is supposed to do and supposed to be, as it's about ensuring that women have the rights to go to work, that they have equal responsibilities as those that men have. And this is the definition within the UN system across all UN agencies. Now, I'm of course representing UNDP, but in UNDP, we are part of the broader UN system and the UN family. And this is the definition as per UN Women that is guiding sort of our overall interventions around gender equality. Any questions up until now from the audience? Else there'll also be an opportunity to do that in a bit. Great. So now, having that definition set, that it's about the equal rights and opportunity and responsibilities for all people, let's move into understanding a bit what the UN's role in this is. Because I'm speaking from a very sort of bird's perspective, you could say, looking down at why it's important for you to integrate gender into your projects. And it's important to know that it doesn't come out of, you know, just some funny idea that some project manager had in the UN or in Jeff or in BirdLife. It's sort of, it's a long, it's been a long way towards reaching a point where we're talking about the gender mainstreaming and gender inequality. And it started, you know, hundreds of years ago, and it really took, you know, started to speed up within sort of the UN, when the UN was created 75 years ago. Gender equality was part of the United Nations Charter. It was mentioned there. And in 1948, the equal rights of men and women were mentioned in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that is special because not a lot of member states of the UN included women in their constitution. Gender equality was not something that was included within the concerns of, you know, member states, but they agreed to work towards it on an international development level. And we move into the 70s, and there is the awareness and realization that while member states are talking about gender equality, while women are mentioned in the very important founding documents of the UN system, it's not being operationalized. We don't move from having women included in the Human Rights Declaration to actually working towards gender equality. And we saw in the 70s, in the 80s, and the 90s, a range of conventions and conferences with UN member states that pushed for the inclusion of women into national laws, into constitutions, making sure that women was protected under the same rights as men. This push came predominantly from NGOs, and the UN member states created a space for them to advocate for these ideas and rights, and which, when we move up to 2000, then came out into the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, and which was later in 2015, as they expired, we transitioned into the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure you all are very aware of, and I'm not going to go into talking about those, but I just want to show this global timeline to see that, you know, it has taken a very long time to get where we are now, where we have one SDG on gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, and it did not come about as a function of time. Gender equality is definitely not something that's achieved over time. And I think while we have achieved a lot, we still on a global scale. I think right now with 10 years until 2030 is the time to really look deeper into the targets of Sustainable Development Goal 5 and ensure that we, across countries, across UN agencies, across NGOs, ensure that we work towards the realization of gender equality. And one last thing, talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, which is, you know, the overarching framework that the UN is working on development within, is that they have, I believe, 153 targets in total, and it's very comprehensive. And working on gender equality is part of that. And it's not something that has been imposed from outside. It's that came down and was just imposed on countries to work towards. The UN is set up by its members. It's governed by the General Assembly, which has participation of all countries, from the US to the UK, to Saudi Arabia, to Jordan, to South Sudan. And that brings a lot of power into working and using the development goals as the objective and as a sort of a catalyst at the same time to work towards your goals. And the point I want to make is that sometimes in the region that I am working in and that you are working in, you can experience a lot of pushback on the gender agenda, especially when you try to include it in projects that are not obviously working towards gender equality, for example, environment projects. But it's important to note to then push back on that idea by saying that this is something that the government and the country that you're working in has agreed towards working on in 2014, 2015. They all agreed to work towards the Sustainable Development Goal to achieve gender equality, regardless of what country you're in. These goals was agreed by all member states. Could they have been agreed in 2020? Could gender equality have had such a prominent position? Could it have had its own goal if we were trying to develop the Sustainable Development Goals in 2020? I don't think so. The world has changed a lot over the last 5 years. And we have countries that we have seen previously had a strong push towards gender equality are taking a step back. So it was a special time, and there was a special sort of place in history to agree on these Sustainable Development Goals, and we have 10 more years to work towards them. And that's what UNDP, where I'm working, is pushing towards. And the SDG 5 is something that that we are trying to ensure that all our partners are also working towards. And one way is by looking at the sub-targets of SDG 5 and making sure that the projects that we are working on are all, and that we're funding, are all sort of including not all of these goals that you can see on your screen now, or sub-targets, but that they're in one way or the other impact some of these. And you can see here, we talk about discrimination, we talk about eliminating forms of violence, valuing unpaid care work, use of enabling technology, and equal rights to economic resources. So that's sort of the sphere of work that we're really trying to push from a global level. Now, how well are we doing in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals? Not that well, but we have come far. But as of 2019, these are some of the statistics, and which makes it even more important that we continue to work on gender equality over the next 10 years. You'll see that 19% of women and girls have experienced physical and/or sexual violence by an intimate partner within the past 12 months. 650 million women and girls have been married before the age of 18. Women do 3 times as much unpaid care work and domestic work as men. Women hold just 23% of parliamentary seats. Women make up only 13% of agricultural landholders, and women are less likely than men to own a mobile phone. So a lot of work still to be achieved in order to move towards gender equality on a global scale. Of course, these figures are global, but you can go and find these figures for your country. We have Sustainable Development Goals trackers for each country. Each country report back on how far they are in achieving the goals. So you can find these for each of the countries that you're operating in to see how well they're doing on achieving these. Now, I want to end this little intervention to talk about what you can do in practice with your organization where you're working. I know my colleagues that are going to speak after will have some much better and more localized approaches to this, but these are just some of the suggestions from UNDP's side. Ask the women and men in the communities that you work in what they need. Invite your donor development partner for a meeting to discuss opportunities and expectations about gender equality and gender mainstreaming. And it doesn't matter that you're not working on a gender equality project. You could work on the flyways, on migration, on access to water. It doesn't matter. There is an angle to gender equality regardless. You can use the SDG 5 indicators in your M&E framework. You should disaggregate all your project data by gender, develop a gender equality strategy for your organization to get started. And then another thing to get your organization to talk more about gender equality and to discuss more about the achievements towards it could be to organize bi-monthly meetings for the project managers to discuss various issues on gender, whether it's inside the ongoing projects or other projects, but just setting aside a half an hour to only discuss gender equality can be a way to enhance awareness and to learn more about gender. Now, this is actually my intervention, and I just wanna finish it off by mentioning that, and it's about counterintuitive. I'm working on gender, and I want to talk about gender and women's rights all the time. But as you're probably all aware, there's much more than just gender that makes up a person's identity, and it's much more than gender inequality that's a barrier for some people's opportunities and rights and responsibilities. In some contexts, gender is not the most important identity marker to look towards. in some contexts and where you're operating, it might be race that you should look towards, color of skin, languages, class. So don't just apply gender uncritically. Always remain critical towards people that only preach one approach. My approach, focusing on gender. Make sure that you look towards other identity markers to understand what's needed from a certain community, because not all women face the same inequality, and not all men have the same privilege. So remain open to starting your analysis from a gender perspective, but being aware and not ending your analysis there, but moving into other aspects that might impact inequality for the people the furthest behind in the communities that you're working on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisette. It's been fascinating to hear the experiences at UNDP. We've got a few minutes that we can take some immediate questions, if any participants have. Please raise your hand. I've seen you've got Barend has a question. Barend, you wanna?
No, sorry, it was virtually clapping. It's the clapping.
Oh, right.
Not the hand sign, the clapping. Sorry.
It's a confusion between clapping and raising your hand. Okay.
Yeah. Great.
But do you have any questions?
Hey, talk. Really well put out what the problems are and how to approach it. Thank you.
Thank you, Baron. Anyone else? Maybe I could pitch another question before we have anyone else come up. Thanks for showing us those sub goals and reminding us the SDG 5 sub goals, and it's fascinating to just see the variations in that. I'm curious to understand if there are any of those sub goals where the global trend is moving in the right direction, and if at all there is any reason to explain it. What would be the main factors facilitating that, and is that indicative of one geographical location doing better than the other?
So I think I can use a very recent example, which we can talk about the target 5.4, the burden of unpaid care and domestic work. We have seen that the share of that has gone down in some countries, in Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, and Finland. And we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic in Jordan, for example, when we were all on lockdown, that while women's share of unpaid care work increased, so did men's share of unpaid care work. It also increased. Of course, women were still doing a majority of the work, but men's hours that they allocated to this also increased. And we are right now working on, at UNDP, applying behavioral science to try to capture the experiences of men who now were at home and had to do domestic work and contribute to the unpaid care work. And we're trying to see if we can use those positive deviances. Of course, there were also a lot of negative issues, such as an increase in domestic violence cases, but taking those positive trends of men suddenly doing more. Of course, it was by force of COVID-19, which is not positive, but trying to use that and see if we can spin this and use it to increase attention and focus and enhance the share of or hours that men take on doing domestic work. So, but otherwise, this one this target is remaining quite stable. We see that while more women are entering the labor market, and in theory they should be have less hours of domestic work, because they are working additional hours in the labor market. We've seen over the last 10 years that their share of care work remained pretty constant. So this is a very difficult one to change, for example, and it's a very hard one to work towards. Another example could be the target 5.6, access to sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights. We're seeing a really hard pushback right now towards working on this, and you have countries that are cutting financial aid to UN agencies if they, in any of their projects, are working, have activities that feed into this, to achieving this target. So we're seeing a pushback just over the last 5 years, something we all countries in the world agreed to this target, right? It wasn't hidden anywhere. All countries, all UN member states agreed to this, but we're seeing a very hard pushback. And that's also what I said, time is not, gender equality is not a function of time. It's something that, we move a bit forward and then we go back. And especially 5.6 is something that we're worried that we might move further back and not be able to achieve by 2030.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for those insights. There's a couple more questions. Perhaps I'll invite one, and then just to reiterate that at the very end of the session, towards the end of the session, we will have a Q&A session. So if we don't squeeze in your question now, please hold on to it and we'll come back to it in that session. But before we move forward, can I invite Alice Baghdadi to ask a question? And could you start by saying which organization you're representing?
Yes. Hello, I'm Alice Baghdadi from SPNL, Society for the Protection of Nature in Lebanon, BirdLife Lebanon. So I have a question about the financials related to this SDG. We know that a major limitation for the MDGs, for gender equality back in the MDGs, was the lack of funding. So we've read many reports about we know how important it is to secure financial resources to be able to achieve the targets within the goal. And we've read lots of reports about the lack of funding means among the means of implementation related to this goal. So how do you think we could do progress in the next 10 years in light of this major limitation among the means of implementation? Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, it's a hard one. I think it's part of the discourse that gender equality is seen as an add-on, right? It's seen as nice to have, but not need to have. But one way, like a small practical way that we're moving towards ensuring that we are accountable towards the financial, towards the finance that we put towards this goal is all of our projects across the portfolio at UNDP, all projects and programs have to now be rated against a gender marker. It goes from 0 to 3. So you can receive gender marker 0 if you have 0 financial contribution within your project towards gender. And then you can move towards 3, which means that gender equality is the primary objective of the project. And the gender marker 3 is then, it's a proxy indicator of your financial contribution towards gender equality. So and this was not decided by UNDP, this was decided by the UN Secretary General, and all UN agencies now have to mark how their projects and programs are financially contributing towards gender equality. So I mean so this does not necessarily mean that we will have more, that we will finance this goal better, but at least the first step is that it provides a level of transparency and accountability towards what money is spent on. And that can then be part of creating awareness about the lack of funding for it. And one way could then be, and that's that's what I would love to see, is that by UN really showing, and our partners showing an indicator of how a percentage share of what funding goes to gender equality, directly to gender equality, we can push donors to also implement such a tracker. And I believe that Canada does that already, but so that within the donor community, that you set your own targets on what share of your overall funding should go towards gender equality. I think that could be a good way of doing it, and to holding donors who are essentially, you know, they are the UN member states. They were the ones who decided to have this goal there, so they need to finance it. I don't know if that's an answer, but those are my thoughts around it.
Yeah, thank you, Lisette.
Thank you, Lisette. In the interest of time, I suggest we move to Charlotte's presentation, but I note that there's a couple of questions, one from Osama and another from Dayo, which we can revisit at the Q&A session. So just hold on to your questions, Osama and Dayo, and we'll come back to them later. Thanks, Lisette, and really great introduction to the global perspectives. I will now invite Charlotte, who will share with us what is the BirdLife International perspective. Thank you, Charlotte.
Thanks, Kiragu. Thanks for inviting me to share how BirdLife International sees its responsibility when it comes to gender and conservation. So for those who don't know me, my name is Charlotte. I'm a program coordinator for the local engagement and empowerment program at BirdLife. So first I'll explain how this type of policy fits within the BirdLife governance. So BirdLife is a partnership of 116 independent civil society organizations. We are governed by a global council, which sets the course for our work. And our council also adopt policies on behalf of the partnership, which national partners are then expected to comply with. And that includes policies that cover rights and social issues within conservation, such as working with Indigenous peoples, respecting human rights, and of course, how we integrate gender into conservation. So why do we have a gender policy? I should probably add that obviously we take our commitments as a global NGO to the SDGs and the Convention on Biological Diversity. We take that very seriously. So we want to ensure that gender is mainstreamed across our projects, programs and research, and that equality is promoted between men and women in all the communities and institutions that we work with. And the emphasis in this case is for us on recognizing the importance of gender in how we understand the communities and local conservation groups that we engage in conservation. So a very brief summary of what we mean by gender. So gender refers to the socially constructed roles, responsibilities, rights, and identities of men and women. It's about recognizing that women and men undertake different activities because of societal norms and values and beliefs, and these can differ between cultures and they can change over time. And gender roles matter because the different values are often placed on men and women's activities. Women's activities are often valued at less than that of men's. For example, as we heard from Lisette, the unpaid activities, such as taking care of the family, housework, but even such things as collecting water or fuel, and also processing natural resources. We need to understand how activities are valued, because that then influences how women and men can access the resources they need for their work. And also, I should say, they are, of course, we've seen this as well in the statistics we said it showed us that these activities are valued differently economically. Very often, women are paid less than men for the same job or task. And how activities are valued is then closely related to who makes the decisions and who benefits from these different activities. And men's voices are generally considered more important than that of women, or at least they are more represented. And at this point, people will often ask, well, if we talk about gender, then why do we go on to emphasize women? But it's because of the consequences of these constructed gender roles that we most often need to then emphasize women's empowerment. Even though it's probably not intended that way, the value placed on men's perspectives often means it's seen as universal, and that means we're missing critical information. And why does this matter in conservation? Effective conservation requires participation of all stakeholders. Our interventions can affect men and women differently because they play different roles when it comes to natural resource management. We want to avoid any negative or adverse consequences from our work, and we risk missing key beneficiaries or key bits of information if we don't include everyone. And working with gender does not mean we're just looking to tick boxes and have participation in equal numbers, but it means that participation is equitable. Equitable means that it's fair and that men and women can both enjoy socially valued goods, opportunities, resources, and benefits. And it's often challenged within conservation that we shouldn't engage with gender because it's not our place. We're conservationists, so let's just focus on nature. But that argument also centers around culture, that we shouldn't interfere. But we believe that it's still possible to respect local cultures while still challenging any practice that might marginalize communities. And at the very least, we should not be the ones who reinforce it. I just want to throw this one in here when we talk about equality and equity. So gender equality is what we would see as the first image where women and men have equal value and receive equal treatment. We all have access to the same opportunities. So on these 3 boxes, everyone has the same size box, despite them being of very, very different heights. Whereas the second image, this is what we would refer to as equity, which is where we have fair treatment for men and women according to their respective needs. Within natural resource management and conservation is often the second picture that we need to strive towards. So what's BirdLife's position? So it's our mission to understand and take account of gender differentiated roles and to promote gender balance internally, that means within the partnership, and externally in the locations among the communities that we work in. And in our implementation of projects and programs, we seek to understand the roles of women and men in the places we work and how that impacts conservation. This has to be based on an analysis of gender differentiated information and knowledge about women's rights and any other gender related policies at a national level. We want to carry out gender sensitive conservation that builds capacity of women and strengthen their rights and roles in natural resource management. We want to facilitate a balanced participation and representation of women and men in all the processes and structures that are created for management of resources. We also want to promote fair and equal rights of women and men in relation to natural resource management and the benefits thereof, and support the empowerment of women wherever that's needed for equal participation. So we want to integrate a gender-sensitive viewpoint in conservation research, planning, action, monitoring, and evaluation, and that includes the development of measurable indicators for gender. We need to provide support to staff so that they have the knowledge and skills to mainstream gender into their work. We want to ensure a balance in the process of recruiting staff, in the terms of conditions of employment and in representation, participation in all the institutional decision-making structures that we have in our organizations. We want to raise awareness of the daily reality of women's management of natural resources and the effects of environmental degradation on women, because it will affect men and women differently very often. We want to build women's capacity to advocate for their rights, roles, and their potential contribution to nature protection. So a requirement for implementing conservation that's sensitive to gender is that gender is mainstreamed across an organization and as operational culture. So internally, we're also committed to advancing gender equality in our own workplace and in our own workforce. But we also need to acknowledge that our partners and our secretariat offices, they have different capacities, needs and experiences in integrating gender. And we operate in different cultural and legal contexts. And we therefore recommend that implementation is as appropriate and in the context of national legislation. So that's all well and good. We have a policy, but how can a project best implement it? So these are the 5 steps to implementation that we recommend. And these are what our guidelines follow. So it's around knowledge, capacity, involvement, empowerment, and advocacy. So what do we mean by knowledge? A first step towards integrating gender is to have reliable information and knowledge about the roles and positions of women and men in a given society and community. So that means carrying out gender study and analysis of the target communities during an initial phase of an intervention, using sex disaggregated data, and apply a gender perspective when analyzing. And that means asking the right questions around: how is our project structured? Are we reaching both men and women with our project? Are there barriers to participation? What kind of adjustments do we need to make? We need to explore the gender norms and values around who does what, who has access to what, and how that impacts men and women differently. Capacity. So to be able to work on integrating gender, it's essential to build capacity and awareness on how we promote gender equality within our work. And building capacity can include delivering a training on best practices, on mainstreaming. It can be focused on the international and national rights and regulations. It can be on the sort of social science methodologies that we need, gender roles, etc. So we recommend that that type of activity is carried out within the Secretariat and at partner levels in the field and with stakeholders. Involvement. So women and men have equal rights to participate and benefit from conservation interventions, but often women are less represented or they don't have their roles recognized. So when all community members understand and value the roles of men and women, it's much easier to include everyone in the civil society groups to make sure everyone benefits from our activities and so on. So we need to build awareness and knowledge of how women and men what about their roles in society and how they contribute to programs, objectives, and fulfill them and include them fully in skills development, the economic activities like livelihoods, and any decisions around the environment that they live in. Empowerment means being able to participate, have spaces to be heard, build skills and confidence through education, setting up independent sources of income, building networks, and telling people about their rights and how to exercise them. So the activity here would be to train local women about their rights and build and strengthen the groups that they might want to have and support their participation in networks, whether that's through further capacity building or exchange visits. These are the types of activities we mean by empowering. And lastly, advocacy. So advocacy can be understood as targeted activities that seek to shape and influence processes and decisions. And advocacy is central to promote gender equality further and the role of women in conservation. So the aim is to help local actors, especially women, to advocate for their role in natural resource management, their contribution to sustainable solutions, and their right to be part of decision making. So it's important here to build capacity of local women to address this through advocacy and facilitate their access to communications channels, to sharing their stories through mass media and social media. Oh, sorry. So how do we then translate this into policies for our own organizations? So based on these guidelines and tools that BirdLife has available, partners can then formulate their own strategies for interventions and action plans, and it can even guide the formulation of a gender policy following exactly the same 5 steps of knowledge, capacity, involvement, empowerment, and advocacy. And here I would say that it's important to, if you're developing a policy on gender in conservation, so that faces outwards, how are we doing this in our projects? It could also be for an equal opportunities policy for staff. And at this point, also would like to mention the whole idea of mainstreaming, because when we mainstream gender within all of our policies, it means that women are not singled out and seen as something separate. It needs to be part of everything that we do. So going through the same steps, here what we mean by knowledge would be to gather information about the gender dimensions or the barriers that might limit participation, whether they're cultural, social, and political, and the different legislation in your own countries that are affecting men and women, and also staff's individual needs. Capacity would be to conduct this type of gender sensitivity training within your own organizations. Ensure participation of men and women in an equitable way and in the policies that represent them. Allow for networks and spaces where issues around gender can be heard and build the skills and confidence to exercise one's rights. And further advocate for gender equality in political and social processes. And here, if you have a progressive approach, share it, inspire others to do the same in your region. One of the ways we work to build capacity within our partners and internally is using a training course, which was developed to integrate rights and social issues in conservation, which is what Intrinsic loosely stands for. This course covers modules on conflict resolution, governance, social diversity and communities. We heard earlier that a community or a person's identity is much more than gender. That's the same with the community. We tend to look at that word, we're engaging local communities, as one thing, but they're not homogeneous. So we need to think about how social diversity also impacts our work. And of course, we have a module on gender. And this course could then be adapted and used for gender sensitivity training. And while it is best delivered in person, we're also adapting it to be online as well. So our module on gender and conservation includes, has as its objective to ensure that participants are familiar with the basic gender concepts, including equality, and being aware of the internationally recognized rights and policies. We need to ensure participants understand how women and men have different activities and responsibilities regarding natural resources, and know how to adapt project elements and activities to better understand the gender-based dimensions. So it raises awareness of how, when we have gender-specific measures, it can actually increase effectiveness of and the impact of our conservation projects, and also how a lack of gender equality can negatively affect sustainability of what we do. So the module includes various case studies, fact sheets and exercises, and also tools and methods for integrating gender into conservation. So we look at how you understand and examine those gender dimensions of your project or organization, adapt the project elements and activities, and adapt project indicators for monitoring this gender integration. So very similar to the steps that the BirdLife guidance outlines. So in conclusion, I would say effective conservation needs men and women to participate fully, and we can take specific steps within our projects to ensure that this process is fair for both women and men. And effective conservation organizations need to be equitable and inclusive places to work. We need to have gender mainstream throughout. And BirdLife is able to guide partners in this process via the position that we have and the guidelines and the different capacity building materials. The position and guidance that we have, they're all available to you on the extranet. And yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. It's interesting to understand the full context that BirdLife International has. I welcome any questions for Charlotte. I don't see a hand raised yet. But as I look around for hands, If you have a question, please start by stating your name and organization, and then you can ask your question. Maybe I'll start off. Would you have some examples on where we can observe negative things happening if gender sensitivity approaches in conservation are not applied?
Yes. So I think I can use a case study that we use in the intrinsic module. So it's sort of just a generic example without any sort of specific details on who and what. So a community forestry project in Thailand had officials that was being implemented. They consulted with the communities to find out what their needs and priorities were. However, in this case, they only had meetings where men turned up. So those were the perspectives that they were given. And men said that they needed seedlings for hardwood tree species, because that was more valuable in the long run. So the communities were then given 3,000 of these seedlings. However, those all died. The seedlings were left to die because it turned out that the women were the ones who cared for the seedlings, and they are the providers of subsistence in this community, but they preferred seedlings of softwood for fuel. So in the end, that part of the project then didn't work. And then when that was realized, that they needed to consider the needs of these stakeholders, the forestry officials carried out a second round of consultation where they included women. And then as a result, they got both the varieties of tree species that could fulfill the needs of both the men and women in villages. And I think this is an example that comes out quite a lot, where we have a sort of a bit of a blind spot, I think, because we again see communities as one thing, but they have very different priorities. I was reading in an article yesterday actually about a World Bank project that was building a road, and one part of the men wanted the road to go in one direction, the women wanted the road to go in another direction, because men wanted it to go to a market that was better for selling their goods, but the women wanted it to go to the next bigger town where they had basic facilities like healthcare. So we see these examples quite a lot in conservation, and we need to make sure that we include all of these perspectives.
Fantastic, interesting, really, really interesting example there. Great. Anyone else with a question?
Yes, can I ask a question, Charlotte, please?
Yes, Anna.
So, thank you so much, Charlotte, for your presentation. I just want to ask you one question. So, did you see the guidelines or the strategic plan is enough to stop, or we should to prepare gender policies for our society?
I think they're a good starting point. I think it's important to seek inspiration potentially from other organizations to see what type of policies that they have. The thing with a BirdLife policy is that it has to be adopted by a global council that wants to see it general enough to apply everywhere. And that means we do sometimes lose some of the nuance that we might see or we would have liked to have in specific regions, because there are different, I guess, priorities. I would say also look into the SDG indicators. For example, as Lisette said, we can actually access these very easily, see what is actually happening in my country, where the different issues that we need to be focusing on. So I think they are a very good starting point, and I think you can, it allows you to ask the right questions throughout, and sort of tells you what are the types of indicators you need to be thinking about.
Interesting. We've got a question from Louis Junior Sad from SPNL, and wonder whether this is also somewhat responded to in the previous example you gave us, which is about, do we have an example which led to a sustainable positive outcome in terms of gender equity from a project implementation?
I'll try to think of a specific example, but what I think what we see is that when we're thinking about sustainability in a conservation project, because they're time limited, to make sure that things don't revert back to sort of pre-project situation, we need to plan for the sustainability. And very often that's expected by donors. We need to show that we've thought about it. And what we recommend in that case is that including all stakeholders, and particularly women as a stakeholder group, will see better sustainability in the long run of livelihoods outcomes. For example, anything that allows them to have an independent source of income, and that can then contribute back into furthering the conservation objectives. So ensuring that you have structures in place that are that have sort of equitable benefit sharing, and that everyone agrees to while you're still there on the site, is really important to be able to for the project to carry on after you've left.
Thanks, Charlotte. Any other person with a question? As you were speaking, Charlotte, it reminded me of an example of, in my own experiences working in Kenya, where as I worked for Nature Kenya, facilitating projects with communities, we realized that we were not having the women represented in the meetings we were planning with the community groups. They were not represented adequately. And on just probing a little bit what was happening, why didn't the women folk want to turn up, we realized that we're setting up the meetings at an inappropriate time for them. After we would be pitching the meetings early on in the day, and that's the same time that they had other things to do before they joined the men folk for other things that they needed to do for the community. So we just oriented in the time.
Yeah.
We were able to allow for a much more inclusive way of engaging with the community and leading on to much more productive outcomes.
And this is a very good example of what we mean by equity, because you went in Nature Kenya, you had meetings with the community, everyone is invited, it's a public meeting, and you've set it, everyone knows it's happening, but it is set at a time that isn't convenient for women. So it makes it equitable by having, setting up the logistics around a time that everyone can enjoy, right? And because the first is, perfect example of equality, but you need to sort of think a bit further than that, which is what you realized. So I think that's a really good example, and something that we see quite a lot when it comes to stakeholder engagement like that.
Perfect. I see a note from Basim asking, can we use and adapt the BirdLife guidelines to our organizations?
Absolutely, that's sort of what it's for. So it is general enough, I think, that it can apply anywhere. And then you can take the elements that you think are most important for your staff and make sure that it addresses both staffing issues, but also the issues around how you then engage with externally towards communities. You could also just take it and use it as it is. It's completely fine, but then it's not necessarily, it doesn't have the ownership that you might like to have within your organization. And I would recommend trying to have ownership of that process with amongst your staff and amongst your management, so that everyone agrees to something that, that you have created.
Perfect. I see Osama, is that a new hand, or you raised, or is it the same question you had earlier on? That's the hand still stuck up.
No, that's one for this session. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, go.
I just want to probably ask about the possibility to highlight the importance that we set on in BirdLife on the gender issue at the two levels. At the level of partners themselves as organizations, as audited within the quality assurance system of BirdLife, and B, on the projects that BirdLife do deliver and how we assess our gender elements within those projects. Thank you.
So was that a question, or was it just to highlight that?
Yeah, if you can perhaps speak a bit about the gender position within the quality assurance system within BirdLife, and a bit about how we are rating our gender components within the projects that BirdLife does deliver.
So at the moment, and this is something I would love to see changed in the future, we do this very much on a project by project basis. And very often it is driven by the types of priorities that are set by donors, that you need to sort of prove certain gender elements within your project. And we haven't ever done an exercise that actually shows the sort of aggregated impact of how we do it across the board. And that's something I would love to see. Within the quality assurance system, it is part of the organizational questions that we ask partners around what type of policies that they have in place. Having social safeguards in general is increasingly an important part of any contractual relationship between BirdLife and a partner, or BirdLife and a donor, or a donor and a partner, and all these things, because everyone wants to make sure we don't do more harm than good, and we need to prove that we have all the right policies in place, that they are implemented adequately, and that we do this type of gender sensitivity training and mainstreaming throughout our work. So we take that very seriously, but it is more on a project by project basis.
Thank you, Charlotte. I think we can progress to the next session, but should you have any more questions for Charlotte, I would invite you to hold on to them, and we can come back to this at the end. I would now like to invite Ala to give us a national perspective on how RSCN in Jordan has been doing it.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ala. I'm working with RSCN since 5 years ago in the different projects, actually. But since 2 years ago, I'm as a project coordinator. So I want to talk today about how we are building the gender sensitizations in RSCN, how we start in the guidelines and the strategic plan. Okay? So. The article 6.1 of the Jordanian Constitution states that all Jordanians are equal by the law in their rights and duties. Jordan has ratified international conventions and is committed to alleviate the discriminations and promote gender equality. The National Strategy for Women and national agendas calls for the active participation of women and prevents any discriminations against them. So, regarding to this article, we started to work on gender guidelines and strategic plans for our organizations. And based on the gender capacity assessment for RCN, it was agreed to develop operational gender mainstreaming guidelines for RCN. And this is because the number of employed women is smaller than the men. And the second reason was the percentage of women participating in local committees and activities are less than men also. So I think this was no belief in gender in women leaders. This is some of our issues. And the second one, we are working to increase the employment women in our organizations. So we start in the gender guidelines. Why actually did we start in the gender guidelines? The operational steps to lead RCN management and team on gender mainstreaming within RCN policies, internal regulations, programs, and finance. Builds a common understanding between the management and the staff on the organization on mechanism of gender mainstreaming, and the importance of achieving gender balance to provide a supportive working environment for equal opportunities and the promotion of equal rights and duties. The second step, how we will build this gender guidelines. What is the steps to build these guidelines? The first step, various interviews were conducted with our management, headquarters, and field staff. Review the internal strategies, regulations, and system to have a better understanding and operations and system. The guidelines were developed up in the organization's current situation needs a management vision. So the last step to conducted a training workshop targeting RCN departments head on gender equality, different issues to ensure mutual understanding among RCN team on the importance of the operational guides and gender equality mainstreaming on the organizational level. This is how we build these guidelines. This is some of photos from our discussions group. The first photo, this is our staff in RCN, and the second group, the consultants and the gender specialists, we're talking about the direct managers. And this is some photos from the orientation sessions in RCN. The first photo, our staff in Ajloun Reserve, and the second staff from Dibbiyan. And this is the third photos from our staff in RCN in the head office. So this is the guidelines book. Actually, this is in the Arabic version, so why that I didn't share it with all, but we will translate it to English, and I can share it with all soon. This is the book of the gender guidelines. So there is 3 levels of the guidelines. The first level to procedures, the first level to procedures on the enabling environmental actions, which I'm talking about the policies, the strategies, and the programs. The second procedures at the level of organization structures, I mean the regulations, laws, organizational, and structure. And the third level is action at the level of cultural prevalence among staff and communities. And this is going to conduct the workshop and the outreach of our staff. And this is the important level actually. Now, we will talk about the content of the gender guidelines. We will start off the theoretical framework, gender concepts and vocabulary words, integration of gender in the organizations and value, gender goals, practical models and example for gender, and several suggested templates were added, such as employment announcement for example, when we announcement for any job, so we don't use she or he, we just focus on the experience of seekers. And the last, the classification of job levels by sex and a set gender sensitive monitoring and evaluation indicators. And this is very important in the guidelines. So the contents of the guidelines book, what is the gender? I mean the vocabularies of the gender guidelines book. What is the gender? what is the gender rules, what is the gender needs, gender justice, gender sensitive indicators, and discrimination based on gender, gender institutional work, gender goals in the organizations. So this is some of photos from some of our outreach session to know about the knowledge of the gender rules from Ajloon and Dibbeen and our RCN reserves. So the goals. What is the goals of the gender guidelines book? To making gender plans and activities, to creating structures, mechanisms and resource plans, effective measures for gender equality and women's empowerment and comfort. And this is the important point actually, important goal. So after that, we will talk about the third level, reaching equality and justice between women and men in participation and decision making. Expanding opportunities between women and men's choices are equal in all areas of empowerment. And the removal of obstacles in all their forms in an observation that impedes women's enjoyment of opportunities and resources. And the most important point, increase motivation, create an environment supportive of women's work. And this is what we are working in this stage. So we will talk now about the practical models and example of gender, and we add more than models and examples about the gender models. Participations and mechanisms for attracting women. Actually, the organization has successful experiences in integrating gender into funded projects and staying after the project is complete. And for example, Finan Leader Workshop. Finan Leader Workshop, the project has been working since 2002. The project has been implemented with 8 women, and the project has continued until the present time. So this is mean we can continue with our project and we can sustainable our work. This is some of photos from the Royal Academy for Nature Conservation. This is from the Biscuit House. The ladies in the red dress, she is the supervisor of the Biscuit House in Ajloon Academy, and you can visit the Biscuit House and you can talk with her. So this is some of photos from our workshop. This is the Biscuit House and the products. This is the second workshop, Moji Biosphere Reserves. This is some of products. And Dana Biosphere Reserve also. This is the workshop of Dana. And the final workshop, Azraq in Azraq Wetland Reserve. This is the workshop of Azraq. So every year, we conducted some of our colleagues to talking about this, about experience in the work. So some of successful stories where the first lady, she is working in Tisal, she is working with RCN since 10 years ago, and she is working in the Dibbeen Reserve Workshop. And in the second photo, the 2 ladies working in Ajloon Academy. The first lady, she is the supervisor of Biscuit House, and the second lady, she is the supervisor of the nature shop in Ajloon Academy. So after finish talking about the gender guidelines, we will talk now about the strategic planning process. Okay. So after to finish working in the guidelines book, we will start to strategic planning process. So what is the objective of strategic plan? why we think to start working on the strategic plan. The objective of the strategic plan to provide a supportive environment of gender mainstreaming. So that's why we are working now on the strategic plan for our organizations. And that's why we start to add some of activities of the strategic plan. So the first activity, establishing gender unit, formation of an advisory committee of senior management managers, formation of a technical committee of department heads, which was completed with gender issues, communicate with the National Committee for Women. And this is the important activity because they have more experience than us about the gender issues. And the exchanges and experiences with the group committed to gender issues also. Preparing reports for the follow-up for the application of the guidelines for gender integrations. And the implementation of a specialized training program on the concept gender and the mechanism for its integration with RCN members and partners. This is some of activities of our strategic plan. And holding an individual meetings with the association's employees and holding discussions group. Design and implementing programs specific to gender issues, and the important point, midterm evaluation and evaluate the end of implementing a plan. And this is to check if our strategy is active or not, and if there is any gaps or if we want to add any activities more to our strategic plan. This is some of activities what we are working now to active this activities of our strategic plan in RCN. So next step, after to finish from the guidelines, gender guidelines, and from the strategic plan, we should to think more about prepare a gender policy. And that's why I'm asked Charlotte if it's important to prepare a gender policy, or we can stop in gender guidelines, or we can stop in strategic plans of gender, or we have to think more about the gender policies. So now, after to continue my presentations, I will share with you to watch these videos about our colleagues in RCN, and these videos, my colleagues talking about their experience in working with RCN.
Allah, do you want to activate the sound? Or
did you hear the sound?
We can't hear the sound on the video.
Okay, let me check, please.
When you share your screen, you need to click a little box that says also share sound.
And that little box is
if you unshare and start again.
I think you need to stop sharing the video, if I understand Charlotte correctly.
Yes. Did you hear it now?
You need to stop the video and stop sharing, and then sharing the presentation again. Okay. Before you click on the video. As you click on the video, you need to select share sound, right, Charlotte?
Ala, if you can stop share. So stop sharing your screen.
You need to stop sharing your screen completely.
Shannon, do you have this video?
Yeah, Ala, would you like me to do it from my end?
Did you hear it now?
Yes,
Okay.
a bit.
Thanks.
This is the last video. Okay, guys. Before to end this presentation, I would like to say something. Gender mainstreaming on organizational level is ongoing process that starts with the organization's will for change and allocating human and financial resources. So, through these operational guidelines, RCN is committing to take the needed steps to mainstream gender equality, and we are working now to implement the gender strategic plan. So, as NGOs or any organizations, I think we should start to work on the gender guidelines, to start to work on the gender strategic plan, because I mentioned, and my colleague mentions in the presentation today, it's a financial resources for us, and this is allocating a human to change some of behaviors. So thank you so much. And if there is any question, you can ask me, and you can send me any emails. And this is the RCN website if you need to put any information about the RCN's work or the gender guidelines or specific plan. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ala. Thank you for sharing the perspective from Jordan. And if I understand you correctly, you are willing to share the guidelines that RCN have, even though they're in Arabic, for anyone who would like to see them. Is that correct?
Yes, sure.
Okay.
I can share it all.
That's great. Thank you. And over to the participants for any questions. I don't see any raised hands. All right. So as I give people a chance to put their hands up, let me just start by posing one for myself. So RCN has gone through a journey of deciding that you want to have a gender guidelines, through to developing one, and now through to implementation of these guidelines. I'm curious to know what were some of the biggest challenges you had in the journey towards developing the guidelines, and also through the implementation, and how has RCN overcome these challenges?
First of thing, actually, there were a lot of challenges actually. First of one, there's some of people not believe in women leaders.
Sorry, your sound went a little bit strange there. I don't know whether it was just for me.
Our challenge. No belief in the woman.
Ala, just to reiterate that.
Did you hear me now?
The sound went a little bit funny, so if you don't mind just starting the answer again.
Okay. Okay. So you asked me what is the challenges. Did you hear me, sir?
Yes, yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. Okay. The first, as I mentioned, there were some of people in our culture and our society not believe in the woman to be a leader in our society. So we start to think about how we can increase this number of women. And first of this challenge, the cultural and the mentality of the people who are working with them. Because as you know, we are working with more cultural, because the RSCN leads more than reserves around Amman. So there is a different thinking about the woman, how she can to lead, how she can to be a supervisor or to leader. So this is some of challenge. So we start to conducted sessions and the outreach, and we were talking about the gender and what is the important about the genders and what is the gender can be how the gender guidelines will add some of positive issues to our society. So we start to conducted some of targeting group to talking about the gender mainstreaming and the gender equality and the benefits of gender guidelines and the benefits of the gender equality. And this is some of the important level and how the gender guidelines and the gender equality will help us to thinking out of box about the gender concepts and some of parts how to actually how we can involve the gender guidelines in the part of our work. So actually this is one of the important challenges. It was the mentality and some of the cultural behaviors in some of peoples.
So changing the cultural perspectives in the communities that you're looking to engage.
Yes, actually, and actually not in the head office or the employees in Amman. Some of the challenges were from the local communities, from some of behaviors of those people actually, but after conducting the training session and the awarenesses and the outreach about gender, some of them, the mentalities were changed about this concepts. So they are thinking out of the box and wearing the gender glasses. So they were thinking more than the difference of this. So that's why I think this is the important step to starting with outreach sessions, to conduct the target groups and some of people's to discussions on the focusing the groups, and they can to talking more about the humanities and about the genders, not just to focus on the financial resources or to focus on the behaviors of people. No, we can talking about the humanities and how we can see the woman, the employees woman, and this is some of how we change these challenges, or how we solve these challenges.
Okay, great, thank you. Thank you. Any other question for Ala? Perhaps maybe I'll expand across the audience and just suggest, do you have any participants from an organization that also has a gender policy? And do you want to speak to how that is helping to improve the way that you engage with the beneficiaries you work with? As I know
the beneficiaries
it's
between the partners, you mean?
Yes, to the partners represented. Do we have any other organizations represented that may want to just give another dimension, an example of how, if you have a policy, if you have guidelines, how that is facilitating your work?
Actually, you mean if I can help any organizations, or or how the partners help us to?
Sorry, it's a general question to everyone in the webinar. In case there was another national context that anyone would like to share, in case the organization has a policy.
Okay, Basima.
Did you say Basima?
Basima, you are muted. Can you unmute yourself, please? Basima,
we're having a technical problem with Basima's.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I was muted. I said thank you, Kirago, for this question. Actually, it's not really a policy for the whole organization, but it's a manual that shows how SPNL addresses women on the local level from the communities where we work. How do we work with these women? How do we get them involved? How do we make sure that their voice is raised within decision making within the community? And also it's like a participatory approach to take their opinion about the challenges in the site and how to find solutions together. So it's maybe it's a start at least on the local level, and we take into consideration the gender issues within the organization, but without writing yet a policy or a guideline. So I think it's a step forward, but we need to work further on strengthening this issue within the organization.
Thank you,
on the other hand, I have a question that I wrote in the chat. I think it passed. Can I raise it now?
Of course. Whom do you want to direct the question to? From one of the speakers or all of the speakers?
Convenient to Lizette, because it's related to the unpaid work of mostly it's women. This has been from the beginning, when raising gender issues, it has been always not valued as unpaid work within the society. And this definitely is related to decision-making issues, whether it's within the family or outside in the whole society. My question is there any progress in terms of valuing the unpaid work, or we are still in the same position as in the start? And thank you.
Thanks, Basima. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah. I think, unfortunately, there's not much progress. We do see that, you know, on a very small scale now. I can share the statistics with you later, and I don't have them on top of my mind right now, but we are seeing an increase in men taking on a share, but it's very local, it's very localized. So as I mentioned, we see Nordic countries and we see, yeah, those countries, and we don't, and then we see that with the COVID-19, there has been also an increase in the amount of work that men do at home, but not an equal decrease in the number of hours that women take on. It changes it's a very localized changes and not really something we can measure globally as a significant increase. Ideally, as women take on more decision making and enter sort of the formal paid economy, they're already part of, you know, the economy by taking on unpaid work, because that contributes directly to the paid economy. But as they go out and take what we would call formal paid jobs, they should ideally, you know, decrease, and their hours should decrease at home, but they're not. I wouldn't say that there's any significant change, but I can share some of the reports we have on the topic. Does it answer your question, or?
Actually, one side. My main question was, since the start, when we were in university, and whenever we wanted to do a survey, usually the unpaid work is considered the least in the hierarchy, and it's not really valued all over. My question is this has changed? Because unpaid work, it takes the decision making always to the person who has the paid job, who gets the money to the family. Usually it's linked with him or her according to who gets the money inside. And unpaid job also, although it's important, but it's not valued all over, whether in the family or generally in the legal or policy issues. So,
yeah, I think that there are discourses around this that it could change. For example, we're seeing discourses and debates around universal paychecks and citizen paychecks. So in the sense that the government will reimburse you for being a citizen by, you know, whether you're working or not working, you'll get a basic paycheck, a basic, I think a basic universal pay. I think that is a recognition that all people are productive and are contributing to our national economies. So I think it's something that's being talked about, recognized, but also I don't have the life experience to know if it has changed over the many last decades. But I can say that there is an academic discourse around it, which has, you know, tendencies to then trickle down and become part of a mainstream discussion. So I'm positive about the change, but I don't think that generally among us and among people that unpaid work is more valued now than what it was 10 or 20 years ago. But maybe some other colleagues here in the room know about that or have another perception.
I see a very interesting comment posted on the chat by Charlotte, which, Charlotte, do you want to speak to that?
My statistic?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can recommend this book, by the way. It's a book about exposing data bias in a world designed for men, and it's called Invisible Women. But it says that globally, it's estimated that unpaid care work contributes $10 trillion to the annual global GDP. So if you want a number behind it and how much this actually is part of our society, that's a really big one. But I think what's interesting is what happens on the national and local level about that. So if you have a policy within your organization that has that gender perspective, that should then take into account the fact that if women are they're still the primary caregivers, then how are you adjusting the work-life balance within your organization to benefit women so they don't fall behind in the workplace? So while those sort of cultural changes are still happening, but they're happening slowly, even in like in where I'm from, I feel like that's happening really slowly. And but if you have a workplace that recognizes that division, you could have policies around flexible working, or we think about, I like the example Ala gave around recruitment, making sure you remove the gender pronouns so that anyone can see themselves represented, and you know, ensuring that you have that sort of inclusivity in your workplace. I think that's a really important aspect of it.
Perfect. Very well. Really nice examples there. And I'm acknowledging that we're almost coming to the end of the session. We've got about 4 minutes just before we conclude our affairs. And I just wanted to, first of all, recognize that we have a very diverse audience here. As I observed, we've got about 24 people accessing, actually slightly more, because in our Amman office, there's 3 colleagues there accessing from one account. But I wanted to recognize that we've got partner representation, as far as I can read, from Lebanon, from Jordan, from Ethiopia, from Egypt. And if I have left anyone, I would encourage you to quickly unmute yourself, say your name and your organization. But also from the BirdLife colleagues, we've got people who are accessing from Cambridge, Amman, Nairobi, and Accra, just to give a sense of who's in the webinar today. Have I left out anyone from any partner organization represented? Anyone wants to quickly say something about it, about themselves? Rather, basically, who you are, which organization? And I've seen my colleague who's normally based in Dakar, Haja, joining in as well. Okay, so as we conclude, I think I want to just round up that the emphasis here now. Initially, I had a tricky question for you, Lisette, around why UNDP. I mean, we've got a gender SDG goal on gender that has 5 sub goals. Amongst them is some of the aspects on women, but the emphasis in terms of what UNDP wants to really drive home is not only gender equity, but women empowerment. It's kind of underlining the aspects of women empowerment. And I just wanted to understand very, very briefly from your end why that is underlined from the UNDP context. Of course, I think based on these conversations today, we get a sense of why, but is there any additional emphasis you want to highlight here?
Well, I think from UNDP side, we acknowledge that through gender equality, that it's not only about, you know, it includes all gender, whether it's women, men, or other genders. It goes for everyone, but at the same time, we do acknowledge that the contexts are different, and in some contexts, in some countries, there is a real need to support women's movements, activists, local CSOs in providing additional resources, as Charlotte's presentation also showed, to bring them to a level playing field and to support particularly women that are facing, in some countries, a lot of barriers. And from UNDP's perspective, we do acknowledge that men, boys are also gendered people, and we do work around that topic on masculinities, but especially in Jordan, and in the MENA region, we are working equally much directly with women and really targeting one gender to support women. So I think that's why it's important to emphasize that aspect as well,
Sure.
to prioritize work.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Once again, I want to really appreciate our speakers, Lisette, Charlotte, Ala. Thanks for giving us that broad perspective and also the national context, and to give us an idea of how this can work at a national context and the value of what it brings to our work in conservation. I think I just want to reiterate that this is one of many webinars that we hope that can be run under the banner of the Migratory Soaring Birds project. And should you want to learn more about the project, you're very welcome to locate more information on the MSB website, and that is found on it's a page within the BirdLife website. And I think you can be able to look at a lot more information from there if you just look for the Migratory Soaring Birds project on the BirdLife website. With that, I just want to again thank you so much for your participation. Thank you for joining us this morning, and we want to welcome you again to any other session that we will have that will be announced later on in the coming weeks. To that end, I also want to thank our speakers again. Thank you so much, Lisette. Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, Ala. Thanks as well to Shannon, who's been watching things on the background, making sure that we are all coordinated all right on the technology side. And to our colleagues in Amman who've been part of organizing this session. Once again, thank you so much, Osama and Muna and Ezra. All the very best. Have a good day. Enjoy yourselves and see you soon.
Thanks for organizing.
Thanks, everyone.
See everyone.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.